Panama was Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first stop on his 6-day trip in Latin America. He is in El Salvador today and will be off to Guatemala, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic next. Now, what is the significance of his trip? Let's hear from Mike Leon. He is our NTD News contributor and the host of the Can We Please Talk podcast. Good morning, Mike. Good to see you again. Now, that's his first international trip, really. What are your thoughts on him starting his travels in Latin American countries? Well, other top diplomats often, go for Europe or Asia.
Yeah, well, Evelyn, first off, good to see you first and foremost. I was very vocal about this during the nomination process of Marco Rubio because Cuban background, we both have the same background. Our parents coming here from Cuba in the 1950s and 60s. He speaks Spanish fluently. And this is the first time a Secretary of State, I believe, has made a venture to these countries since, I believe, Colin Powell went back in the early 2000s under the George W. Bush administration. So the significance is it means that the U.S. knows that these countries are very paramount to two things. One, the Panama Canal, like we just mentioned before in that package that Daniel played there, it's really imperative to trade. The amount of money that the U.S. makes in trade from the Panama Canal is critical. Obviously, what China is doing along the canal is something that President Trump campaigned on, and obviously he's been talking about in press conferences over the last couple of months. But also the second part of this, and he's visiting with President Bukele today in El Salvador, is really about the triangle countries and immigration that flows into Mexico. And obviously we know that the president ran on a stronger border and immigration. Marco Rubio has been very vocal about making sure that those countries are uplifted as well. So that way there isn't mass migration that is coming to the U.S. So those are really the two key themes of the trip.
Now, let's start with Panama. His first stop there was for the canal, and probably to your point, a lot about surrounding the first point about the Panama Canal and trade. Now, tell me about the talks they held, and if Rubio was actually able to help find common ground between the U.S. and Panama for the canal.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody down here in the business world that actually does a lot of business in Panama because when Trump first, if you remember, Evelyn, before he took office, was doing all the press conferences about Greenland and Panama Canal, and all the media was abuzz about what it is that he was talking about. And it's what Marco Rubio kind of went over there to kind of quell the fears of the Panamanians, right? First and foremost. There needs to be something that is done about what China is doing surrounding the ports. And the U.S.'s fear is that China will have too much influence there, and that could really kick off, a lack of a better term, a trade war, and something that we could be at the deficit of. And I think meeting with Molino there, I mentioned this before, and I think this is critical. It's not really being discussed, but the fact that Marco Rubio is fluent in Spanish, the fact that Marco Rubio doesn't need a translator when he's communicating with these presidents of these countries as he goes to Costa Rica and Guatemala, I think that is something that is critical to really drive home the message of what President Trump wants to done there and what America is really going to do for these countries. And I don't think that has been communicated, as we have seen, because we haven't had Secretary of State's venture, like you mentioned before. They normally go to Europe or Asia. And I think Marco Rubio is showcasing that, but he's showcasing it in the language that they all speak and are comfortable in. And I think that is a really good starting point for the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and the diplomatic message that they want to send.
Right. Molina also says now that Panama won't renew its participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative. How significant is this for the U.S.? And does that mean that Panama is maybe accepting or at least meeting the U.S. halfway in terms of the conditions of keeping the canal neutral from China?
Yeah, it's to your second part, Evelyn. Like it shows it's a good sign faith, right? Like I think that's what right now Secretary of State Marco Rubio wants to get at, right? Because and it's going to happen, as you're going to see today with El Salvador. There was a Safe Country Act that President Trump had enacted that President Biden took away when his administration, and that was about migrants and stuff like that. So I think this is part of this entire trip, is to get these old arrangements that at least were in place or at least were talked about during the first Trump administration communicated to these countries. And I think that is part of the trip. And I think Panama making that gesture. But remember, there's a huge economic impact to Panama of what China is doing. So as reporters have told me that are covered this and people that are based down there in Panama, the U.S. has to make an argument, a compelling argument as to why they will at least ensure the economic gain for Panama versus what China is currently doing with its ports of entry and what they've set up down there. So I think Marco Rubio went down there to kind of communicate that, and he's done that very well.
So since we have 1 minute left, let's move on and talk about El Salvador quickly, because that's a second stop. That's where he's right now. We know that San Salvador was one of the world's most dangerous cities just a few years ago, and then President Bukele cracked down on organized crime. Now, how is the U.S. looking to benefit from cooperation with El Salvador, and what is the top issue on Rubio's agenda being there?
Yeah, so I alluded to this before, and if you remember, Evelyn, Vice President Kamala Harris got killed for this, for maybe not going to these countries. She did end up going, if you recall, to Guatemala and a couple of the Triangle countries. But this is where a lot of the migration patterns happen from Guatemala, from El Salvador. I know he's not meeting with the Nicaraguan president, but Bukele in that region, and some people would call him a certain thing in that region, but he has really cracked down on crime and focused on crime. And he's focused on the why people are leaving El Salvador, which was because of the different gangs that are down there that control the city. And he's, in essence, since 2017, taken really control of that country. And I think the biggest thing that they're going to talk about, I mentioned this before, is this Safer Country Act that President Trump administration had administered, which was really about keeping migrants in El Salvador and figuring out a way to have an economic benefit for them being in El Salvador versus coming to the U.S. through Mexico. And I think that's going to be at the core of these conversations, but also the region particularly as well, as to why so many migrants decide to leave those countries and come up to the U.S. And I think it's going to be a very good meeting from what I'm hearing and stuff like that. But I also think that this is Rubio's time to shine in these countries, because these countries are paramount to us.
Got it. Thank you so much for contributing today. Mike Leon, appreciate it as always.